So Pesach is coming up, so I thought this week and the next to devote to Pesach, because I feel that Pesach doesn't only include the foundations of Judaism, but really the foundations of life itself could be distilled from looking closely at the story of leaving of Egypt, of Pesach, and what could explain why, as we know, this Pesach is so fundamental to so much of Jewish holidays, Jewish mitzvot. And I'll start with that. It's above and beyond any important messages. The story of leaving Egypt, it's an incredible story, even in terms of the story aspect. I can imagine it's no accident that the movies that were based on the leaving of Egypt, whether it was the famous movie The Ten Commandments or the Prince of Egypt, were all boxbusters. We saw blockbusters, right? Okay. I mean, just think of all those special effects. The 10 makot have these incredible special effects. There's the humor in it. I think with I always imagine the frogs jumping around. There's something humorous. There's drama, suspense. So anything you can imagine to make a great story. And I'm saying beyond any important messages, it's all there. Even the setting. If you wanted to have a really amazing story to capture the imagination of the ancient world, where would you have it? Of course, in Egypt. In Egypt, the land of the pyramids, the pharaohs, certainly lends itself to making a really powerful, vivid story. So I used to think that this is a wonderful coincidence, because if this is the story we have to tell every year, it is so fortunate that it's such a great story. But ultimately I discovered this was no accident, because the Torah says that God hardened Pyro's heart in order to do what? And in order that you will be able to tell your children and your grandchildren all that I did in Egypt. Meaning, God wanted it to be a good story. It's like a director of a film. You choose the setting, you choose it. God knew that if he didn't harden Pyro's heart, probably after the first signs of pressure, Pyro would have given in and sent us away. No story. So God orchestrated all the events here, so that it would be an amazing story. Why? So that we would have what to tell to future generations. So here we have an insight about how the world works. That sometimes the story is the stories in life are deliberately orchestrated to connect us to life. And I think that the book of creation, Sefer Yetzirah, begins by saying that God created the world by 3 books, Sefer, Svar, V'Sipur, that God created the world with a story. So life in the world is really all a big story. And
history.
What?
History.
His story.
It's like a classic,
history. Got it.
Classic
Okay.
Joke.
Okay.
History is history.
Often I ask myself, is it his story or my story? Sometimes I feel like all these events are happening, and is the other person a footnote in my story, or am I a footnote in his story? Very quietly, both are true. And I think looking life as a story, it really allows us to connect up much more to life, to ask what's life teaching us, and certainly to feel the presence of God in this story. But I'd like to talk a little bit about specifically the story of leaving Egypt. Now, there's a famous saying by the novelist Paul Auster that stories happen to people that tell stories. And from experience, I could tell you this is very true. because when people who tell stories look at life differently. And two people could go through the same day, but one will finish there and say, wow, this was an amazing day. Amazing story happened to me today. And the other person might have gone through the same day and he'd say, what happened? Nothing happened today. So it's really the way you look at reality that creates a dynamic that you see the story, and by seeing the story, it gives life to the story, and the story goes on. Because when someone realizes, I'm part of a story, that pushes you to play your part in it. And so it begins maybe by looking differently at reality, but it leads to the reality being different itself. Now, and I once heard a beautiful saying by the former chief rabbi of England, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, and he said that the Jewish people are not a people with a story, but we are a story with the people. That the essence of what we are, who we are, is the story. And in another context, he has a book that was first entitled "Radical Then, Radical Now," but for some people that was too radical of a title, so he changed to something much more sedate, a letter in the scroll. But he talks about what does it really mean to be Jewish, and he tells a story, a very sad story, of some Jewish teenagers that sent out letters to what they saw to be the great Jewish leaders and intellectuals of their time, to ask them the question, what does it mean to be Jewish? And the few that answered them gave incredibly cynical and disappointing answers. One said, being Jewish is like a genetic disease. You get it from your parents, and sometimes you die from it. And that led to feeling that there's something great in being Jewish. There's something inspiring. It is a call to something. And if we can't identify that, we're not going to survive, especially in the West with assimilation. If we can't answer what it means to be Jewish, why this is something so important that you may have to devote your life to it, or in a Western context, not marry somebody who you have a crush on, because this is something truly significant and important, something at the essence of your existence. And I think if I had one word to answer, what is it? That word, well, in Hebrew I have it one word. I'd have it as hasipur, the story. There's an incredible story, and we're all part of this story. Now, at the heart of the story is that story at the very foundations of leaving of Egypt. And we know that this story, how powerful it is, how it's captured the generations, that we see reality through the prism of this story. And that's how the story could make us who we are. Saying in the Mishnah and the Haggadah, that we have to all look at ourselves as if we left Egypt, meaning we have to look at reality through the prism of the leaving of Egypt. And we know this is true. We know about the American Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King. A lot of his imagery he took from the story of the leaving of Egypt. Certainly, the Let My People Go. Even on his tombstone, it's written the phrase from the Torah about the brothers of Yosef saying, "Let us kill him and see what will become of his dreams." So the story of the Torah, and that vision that I look in a story which is so authentic and true that my story is part of it. This is something that goes beyond the Jewish people. I grew up on the struggle for the freedom for Soviet Jewry, and the activists who spearheaded this struggle both those in Russia and those in the West, for them, they were empowered by seeing this is yet again that same story reappearing. To let my people go, shalach et ami, to the an evil empire persecuting the Jews, and the Jews struggle for freedom and to leave for the land of Israel. I'd like to add also two personal family stories after a question from Rafi about even how on a personal level this idea of leaving, of the story of leaving Egypt is our story, how significant it could be.
Oh, is it? Okay, just to clarify that the understanding of what that verse of "as if we left Egypt" is that in our own days, in our 2018, there are versions of the same Exodus, or versions of the same story of
right.
bondage and redemption.
Right. Finding in your life the
right.
place of looking to.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Now, my wife's grandfather he grew up in a family so assimilated in Germany that the parents thought to protect the children by hiding from them that they're Jewish. And till second grade, my wife's grandfather did not know that he was Jewish. But one day he was disinvited to a birthday party, and he asked, why can't I come? So his former friend said, well, my mother says you're Jewish, and we don't want to have any Jews in our house. And he said, what do you mean I'm Jewish? I'm not Jewish. So they told him, go ask your parents. So he goes home, and he asks his mother the ultimate. He asks his mother, are we Jewish? And he gets the answer that every parent gives to a child when they don't want to answer the question. They say, ask your father. Okay, so he waits to ask his father. His father comes home, and he runs to his father, says, in school they say I'm Jewish. Is this true? And the father realizes he can no longer hide from his children this secret, and he says, yes, indeed, you're Jewish, and you can be proud of it. Okay, so he's told to be proud of it, but he didn't really develop his Jewish identity. In fact, he felt so German that in World War I, he lied about his age for the honor to draft into the army and fight for the Kaiser and the homeland. But in the German army, he discovered the ugly face of German anti-Semitism. And one night he's told that the Jewish soldiers have a night off, and he's probably long enough in the army not to miss the night off. And it turns out it was the night of the Seder. And he had never been at a Passover Seder. And he comes to the Seder and he's sitting next to somebody and explains to him what's happening. And towards the end of the Seder, he sees that some of the soldiers stand up. And he says, why are they standing? And he's told, they just reached the part of the Haggadah that says, L'shana haba'a b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. And those who stand up are Zionists who believe that the Jewish people should return to the land of Israel. And then Ernst Simon, who later became Akiva Ernst Simon, that his great-grandson Hillel Akiva from Shir Hay is named after, he too stood up and made the decision that changed and also saved his life because he became a Zionist. He moved in the 20s to Israel, but tragically his mother was killed by the Nazis. His father died before the war. And to really feel the tragedy of German Jewry, he begged his parents to get out of Germany when they could. And his father said, you're a patriot in the Holy Land, and you don't want to leave your land, even when it's difficult. I'm German, and I'm not going to leave my homeland, even if it's difficult. They're so loyal, so loving of their homeland, and what they were repaid was by brutal murder. Anyway, but so in fact, I could say that the story, I wouldn't be here today without the story of Pesach, without that dramatic moment of Michal's grandfather hearing this story for the first time and having this transform his life. And I think maybe for us, one of the problems is we've heard the story so often from such young age that we don't really think about it. And we don't really ask that question, what is the story telling me about my life and who I am? And if we would, perhaps it would transform our lives as it did Akiva and Simon. Now, as a follow-up story to this, and yet again I'll begin with a quote from Rabbi Yonatan Sachs. I heard this at a lecture he gave in the Marble Arch Synagogue in London, although I see it also appears in his marvelous Haggadah. If you're looking for a really incredible Haggadah Pesach, I would highly recommend his Haggadah, both for the commentary, but even more so, there's a section of essays. And as I said, the story of Pesach, knowing the Haggadah, it's not only about knowing what Pesach is about, it's knowing what Judaism is about and what life is about. And I think his book is very important on this in this way as well. Okay, being as it may, he gave a wonderful lecture saying that in the ancient world there were two nations that sought immortality, and both succeeded, each in their own way. The Egyptians sought immortality, and in his wonderful English he said, so they built magnificent monuments to withstand the winds of time. Right? No Americans speak like me speak like that. So anyway, and so that was really through death. They achieved eternity through something about a commemoration of death. And I think, in fact, most people in the world have heard about the pyramids. On the other hand, the Jewish people sought another form of immortality. The Jewish people leave Egypt, and the first thing that Moshe tells them is, tell it. What you've seen today, tell it over to your children. It's a eternity not of death, but an eternity of life. And the following story is in that meeting point between these two forms of eternity. We were once visiting my parents who live in Manhattan, and Michal took the kids to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now, if you want to summarize in one word for kids, an art museum, boring, exactly.
I love art.
Right. So Rafi said he loves art museums, so he's certainly no normal kid. But normal kids, art museums, boring. So they're going to the museum, bored, but finally they got to what they thought to be the museum's playground, aka otherwise known as the Egyptian wing. And one of my children, whose name is, we'll keep to ourselves, is started climbing up on this 4,000-year-old Sphinx. And after that, Michal, the kids, got a private guard to escort them through the wing and out of the wing. So when they left the wing, Michal assured that she would hear this big sigh of relief, but instead the large guard comes over and says to my wife, "Is that Hebrew your kids are speaking?" And he was amazed to see little kids making a ruckus, running around talking the ancient language of the Bible. So here in a nutshell, there's a meeting of two worlds. The world of an eternity of death behind glass that needs guards to make sure that nobody touches anything, or an eternity of life. So the Jewish people's eternity goes back to our ability to tell the story and always live the story, and that's what makes us who we are. Now, and now let's maybe broaden things a bit. The Zohar teaches that just like there is a mitzvah to teach the story of Pesach, there is a mitzvah to tell of all the stories that God does for us. And in fact, every day, 3 times a day, in Shmoneh Esrei, when we say Modim, we say that we will nisaper, we will tell about the miracles that God does for us every day. And in many ways, I think we have to do a lot of tshuva, because we're always saying that we will tell the story, the miracles of every day, but when do we do that? So I think a great advice for serving God, connecting to God, a practice that I try to do, is that in Modim, when you get to the end of Modim, before Val Kulam, and on all of them I thank you, add in a few words of your own. Tell something about the miracles, the stories that has happened to you today. And if you can't find any, that means you haven't examined what's happened to you today well enough. Okay, so this is one teaching about Pesach, about life being a story. Stories happen to people that tell stories. Stories happen to nations that tell stories. About how central the story of leaving Egypt is. About how the world itself is a story. And how we should each find and discover our story and our part in it. Okay? So maybe, and we have some more time, so maybe let's tell a little bit about one of the heroes of leaving Egypt, who's I would almost say almost an anonymous hero, because we don't really know his real name. And who, of course, am I referring to? Who?
One of the two Israelim fought.
Okay, so there are these two guys who fought it out. Okay, well, one might be the anti-hero, and maybe they both had a role in getting the story across. The what?
Has to be Pyro.
Okay, maybe Pyro. Okay, well, I would say the person who we call Moshe, but as I said, almost anonymous, because we don't know what his original name was. We have a book called, in Hebrew, Shemot, names. But the person who's the main figure in this whole story, we don't even know what his Jewish name was. We have an Egyptian name, Moshe, which is very similar to Ramses, as pointed out already by the Netziv in his commentary to the Torah. So we have an Egyptian name that was given by the non-Jewish daughter of a major enemy of the Jewish people, but presumably the holy parents of this child, Amram and Yocheved, presumably had a name that they gave to their child. And nowhere did the Torah see fit to tell us the original name of Moshe. What name did his parents choose for him? What name did he get in his Brit? So this is certainly something to get us thinking. Why is it? It's so deliberate that it's not told. It's the Torah wants us to always use that name, not the name that Yocheved and Amram gave Moshe, but the name that the daughter of Pyro gave to him. And I think what underlies this is that the essence of Moshe goes back to that name. There's a name that could express someone's essence. And that name and that entire story about the daughter of Pyro drawing Moshe out of the Nile is the fundamental event in the life of Moshe. And what all we know of Moshe could really be traced to that formative incident. We know, if we look at that story, we have the daughter of Pyro. She sees a terrible injustice about to take place. Her heart is filled with compassion, and she doesn't stand on the side feeling empathetic, but she gets involved and tries to fight against that terrible crime and injustice. By doing that, saves the child. If you look at Moshe, the three stories we know about Moshe before God contacts him, it's all the same story. Moshe is also seeing, the first story we meet Moshe, he sees a terrible injustice about to happen. A taskmaster beating the slave, and in context beating him, something that would leave, possibly beating the slave to death. Moshe, he's a prince, he has so much to lose, he gets involved to save the victim. The second story, again, two Ivrim are fighting. Again, he gets involved. He tells one of them, Russia, why are you hitting the other person? It's again, he sees an injustice, he gets involved. He runs off because he knows his life is in danger. And his friends would tell him, Moshe, keep a low profile. And what does he do? He gets to that new location and right away gets himself into trouble. Because again, there's an injustice taking place and he doesn't hold it to himself. He doesn't control himself. He starts off on the left foot with all the men in the town by sticking up for the daughters of Yitro. So all we know about Moshe, it all goes back to this formative incident. So here is yet another example about perhaps Moshe heard this story. Perhaps Moshe knew the story about how his life was saved because somebody, a total outsider, of another nation, who didn't know him, didn't stand by. Maybe that's the story that Moshe grew up on and what made Moshe into what he is. And ultimately, of course, that story achieves its closure, that just as the daughter of Pyro takes Moshe out of the water, Moshe is the servant of God to take the Jewish people out of the water, and you have the dramatic end of the story of leaving Egypt through the splitting of the Red Sea. Okay, so that's the Moshe story. And again, a story which is about a story. So Moshe, we could suggest that Moshe, his name was Moshe because that represents the story that guided his life and made him to what he is. Sof davar, hakol nishma, et Elohim yira, ve'et mitzvotav shmor, ki ze kol ha'adam.